Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan and welcome back to the channel. As climbers, we have all spent a huge amount of time consuming climbing media, but if you're a climbing nerd like me, the thousands of climbing videos on YouTube is still not enough. Ever since I started climbing in 2019, I listened to hundreds of climbing podcast episodes, ranging from tips and tricks of being a better climber, unheard stories of famous professional climbers, as well as the history of the sport that we all love so much. I've split 10 climbing podcasts into 3 categories so you can listen to what suits you the most. Starting off with the category of interview and guest-based podcasts. First on the list, we have the Nugget Climbing podcast. The Nugget Climbing podcast is hosted by Stephen Demmett. It is a podcast which I've been listening to ever since it started in 2020. It's got over 160 episodes, it's very well made, and it has a long list of professional climbers, influencers, and people with great stories on the list of guests. That includes Alex Honnold, Emily Harrington, and Magnus Mipple. Every episode, Stephen invites a new guest onto the show to take a deep dive into their lives and their most recent exploits. The episodes are very up to date with the news of the climbing world, with some of the most recent guests being Aidan Roberts, Will Bosey, and Emil Abramson. Stephen, as a climber who's living in a van, driving around the country, and doing climbing podcasts, Stephen embodies the spirit of an obsessed climber. He often asks his guests about training tips, nutrition guides, as well as mental tactics for climbing. The Nugget has most definitely matured since the beginning of the episodes. Stephen is quite keen to ask the guests about methods of getting stronger, in fact getting into the very nitty-gritty of all the training plans and training protocols. However, in the more recent episodes, Stephen has steered clear of going to the deep end and definitely talk much less about finger training protocols, but more general principles everyone can apply to their climbing. In my opinion, Stephen feels like a representative of the everyday climber, asking questions we all want to know. As a podcast host, Stephen is able to bring out the most intimate stories from his guests. One of my favorite parts of the show is at the end of every episode, Stephen would ask his guests what they're most grateful for. It definitely humanized all these professional climbers a lot more and really can connect the audience with the guests. The Nugget, as the first on the list, is definitely one of my favorites. Next up, with the Jamcrack Climbing Podcast by Niall Grimes. The Jamcrack holds a special place in my heart. I usually tune into podcasts simply because who the guests are, but for the Jamcrack, I just want to hear what Niall has to say this week. As podcast hosts go, I think Niall is one of the funniest ones for sure. He's funny and entertaining. The episodes feel like a mix of a comedy show and an interview. Every episode starts with Niall doing a monologue, ranging anything from 5 minutes to 20 minutes, or sometimes even half an hour, ranting about things happening to his life, in the climbing scene, or just in the world in general. It is every bit as surprising as it is entertaining. It happens quite often that Niall gives his guests a hard time, which is something that most podcasts would never do. That sparks up some very friendly and interesting conversations. I've actually met Niall last year when I was traveling in Sheffield. It was really good meeting him and he was very nice in person. Definitely check out his podcast. Now with the climbing podcast royalty, the Enormocast by Chris Kalous. I did not discover this podcast until a year ago and it was basically a dark hole. There's so many episodes of just amazing content since it started almost 10 years ago. The Enormocast is very different from any other podcast on the list. Instead of being only bouldering and sport climbing centric, the Enormocast is really about all things climbing. From big wall adventurers, mountaineers, to writers. He's had extremely rare guests on, such as Janja Garnbrenn and Nali Hurtaivo. One of my favorite guests on the show, however, is Boone Speed, a climber and more famously a photographer. Simply an absolute legend. The photos this man takes are just mesmerizing, and it was great to hear the behind the scenes of all these amazing shots. On top of the amazing guests, Chris Kalous alone is a great reason to turn to the podcast. He's hilariously funny and has a willingness to offend his guests every now and then. His introductions of all the ads are all in his own style and it just makes me laugh all the time. I think this is going to be an enjoyable listen no matter who you are and anywhere that you are. Now with the CIA. No idea what that is? It's the Climbing Intelligence Agency. There's one word for this podcast and it is legendary. This is a podcast with long history but not very many episodes. What it lacks in quantity though, it makes up for in the quality. Every episode is absolute gold. The older episodes have outdoor legends such as Daniel Woods and Dave Graham. Before they have climbed all the harder stuff they have climbed today. The newer episodes include IFSC gold medalists Natalia Grossman and Meiji Schlack. I find this podcast to be very fascinating simply because the guests on this show are just so unique and special. The hosts, Vladik and Beyond, seem to know all of their guests very well. Seems like they've been in the climbing world for a very long time and they're very comfortable with the guests. These two are also very up to date with the comp scene. They have no problem taking a deep dive into the modern day competition style at all. As someone who watches every single competition, it feels unbelievable to get to understand the mindset behind the best climbers in the world. Another unique guest on the show is Roman Stanik, Yanya's coach. The podcast doesn't go into a certain one deep topic for every episode. Honestly, it feels like the hosts are just saying what's up to the guests and they're recording their conversation. Moving on to the second category, we have some training-centric podcasts. When I first started climbing, all I wanted to do was get stronger and better at climbing. These podcasts helped me realize a lot of things, such as what is a typical finger training protocol, how to structure a training plan, and so on. At the end of the day, how do you know which way of getting stronger is the best if you don't know what is out there? Now with the Lattice Training Podcast. It's hosted by Lattice Training Company itself. Lattice as a training company was founded by Tom Randall, one half of the famous crack climbing duo, the White Boys. To me, this climbing podcast is an extension of what the company does in general. Lattice is a training company which provides training plan and tips depending on what your goal is. Similar to the YouTube video Lattice does, the podcast goes into great detail for all aspects of climbing. With Lattice's own team of educated professional coaches leading the way, alongside professional athletes and nutritionists, this podcast brings practical advice for anyone who's looking to get better at climbing. This podcast brings advice ranging anything from improving your finger strength, flexibility, and discussions on the most viral, trendy training methods. Lattice is also not afraid to get into some of the lesser discussed topics, such as the effects of age, hormones, and menstrual cycle on climbing performance. If those are topics which interest you, then this is the podcast for you. Next on the list, we have the Powell Company Climbing Podcast, hosted by Chris Hampton. The Powell Company is one of the first podcasts I ever listened to. Ever since the podcast started in 2015, they have produced over hundreds of episodes. When I first started climbing, they offer a lot of knowledge on different aspects of climbing, which shaped my fundamental understanding of climbing training. The Powell Company podcast is an interview-based podcast. However, there are episodes which are simply discussions between Chris and a long-time and reoccurring guest, Nate Droley. I very much enjoy the back and forth between the two. They bring in different perspectives in some of the more controversial topics in climbing, including grade and when to walk away from a project. One of my favorite episodes is the one where they're talking about the ways in which your friends are holding you back in your climbing. A problem which I'm sure all of us who are dedicated to climbing have experienced at one time or another. No matter if your friends are better or worse than you, there are difficulties which comes with both. Next on the list, we have the Testpiece Climbing Podcast by Timothy Kang and Josh Horsley. I love this podcast and I just click into every episode whenever a notification of a new episode has come out. If the name Tim Kang sounds familiar to you, I'm sure you have heard of his climbing YouTube channel, or maybe you have known him from the walk-up circuit as he has competed there for quite a few years. He's currently focusing on his efforts on outdoor boulders, especially finding king lines on high ball, amazing, scary boulders. As for Josh, he's also an absolute crusher, climbing stuff well over the double digits. The Testpiece Climbing focus on all things high-level climbing, as they say in every episode. I've listened to many episodes of climbing podcasts on how to get better at climbing, and there are a lot of reoccurring ideas. But I genuinely think the Testpiece brings up topics which are not discussed anywhere else. Topics such as mindset, timing, balance, and these are simply some of the examples. With their extensive history in climbing and coaching, content is more suited for climbers who already have a basic understanding of climbing knowledge and are looking to take it to the next level. The podcast does not have guests on all the time, but I don't think it's a problem at all. The extent to which the two are able to deep dive into every single topic they bring up is simply amazing. As someone who really wants to up my game in climbing, the pair is able to demonstrate the intricacies of all the climbing techniques as well as mindset preparation, which are always that could affect the way we climb. Personally, I enjoyed the talks about mindsets the most, and that's a constant and recurring topic on the show. It just comes to show that for the elite level of climbing, the mental preparation is just as, if not more, important than the physical ones. The mindset you have towards a competition or your outdoor project will affect your outcome significantly. In addition, they also talk about the different ways to deal with the outcome, because as we know, we don't always send and we don't win every single competition. Next up, we have the Struggle Climbing Show, hosted by Ryan Devlin. It talks about one of the biggest aspects of climbing, an aspect which we all battle with constantly, and that is struggle. Instead of just talking to famous climbers about their successes and sins, this podcast dives into all kinds of struggle professional climbers face and their ways of dealing with them. The list of climbers who have been on this podcast are quite star-studded. They include Alex Magos, Kevin Jorgensen, and the one and only J-Star Jonathan Seacrest. It's basically the Hall of Fame of climbing. For the last category, we have some story-centric podcasts. The Careless Talk climbing podcast by Aidan Roberts and Sam Pryor. If you have been on any social media at all and you're a climber, you would have definitely heard of the name Aidan Roberts. He's one of the 6 people in the world who have climbed the magical grade of V17 9A on boulders and has simply been taking social media by storm. Alongside is the other host, Sam Pryor, who is also a very strong climber. He's climbed 8B plus V14 on boulders. Together they have created a very special podcast that I find surprising and I enjoy very much. With Aidan being one of the strongest climbers in the world, it's more or less expected that there's a lot of talk of simply hard climbing. But despite his best efforts in explaining how Burden of Dreams is in a style that he enjoys much less than Alphane, or one that suits him much less, it's the conversations regarding ethics and mindsets which interest me the most. For top-end climbers to balance fame, stress, and expectation, climbing becomes a job rather than simply a passion alone. It invites a lot of interesting conversations that I've never thought about. The guests who occasionally come onto the show, that includes climbing star Max Milne and Alex Waterhouse. Most of the guests are UK-based climbers who are friends with the host. That makes the conversations very friendly and comfortable. My favorite guest on the show was Sam Lawson, creator of the Wedge Climbing channel. It's a dark hole which I've spent many hours devouring some of the most cinematic and pretty climbing footages out there. It will most definitely bring you some new perspectives on certain aspects surrounding the climbing life that you might not have considered previously. And lastly, we have the Circle Up Climbing podcast by Alison Fess and Kyra Condi. They are most definitely the new kids on the block in this list of climbing podcasts, but they're most definitely the more famous and strongest podcast duos out there. They started the Circle Up Climbing podcast in late 2022. There are more than a dozen of episodes to provide an interesting take on body image, motivation, and mental struggles as professional climbers. The parts I enjoy the most are the behind the scenes of aspects of competition climbing that you never get to hear from anyone else. That includes drug testing, fear of failure, and the very mindset of being competitive. As a climber who's trying to get into the world of competition climbing, I share a lot of the sentiments they have about competing. With Alison and Cara being lifelong friends, they are very comfortable with each other during the podcast. The podcast feels like story sharing amongst friends rather than an interview. There are not a lot of episodes, but I'm sure there are more to come. That was my list of my favorite top 10 climbing podcasts. I hope this video can help you pick a podcast that suits what you're interested in. Let me know if you agree with my list in the comments down below, or if there are other podcasts which you really enjoy. And as usual, thank you very much for watching. Do leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.